Hey friends, welcome back to Huge Studio. My name is Robbie, and recently I finished book 8 of the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, and I'm officially going through withdrawals. So this week, to scratch that itch, I decided to make two of my favorite characters from the series, Prepotente and Samantha, which are two characters who really don't have many interactions in the series, or have much in common at all, other than some mommy obsessions. Prepotente, also known as Mommy's Special Boy, is of course infatuated with his mother, while Samantha on the other hand is obsessed with threatening to kill the mother of everyone she meets. If somehow you're not familiar with this book series, it's one of those that's wildly enjoyable to read, but really awkward to explain. Like, the deeper you get into your explanation, the more it seems like you're recovering from a head injury. But I did my best to describe it a few weeks back when I sculpted Carl and Donut, so if you haven't watched that video, go back and give it a look. Of course, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but if you don't like the series, we cannot be friends. It's one of those you just gotta stick with. The first book is a lot of fun and an absolutely hilarious intro to the series. The second book is just as good, but in my opinion, book 3 is where the series really takes off into something special, because from that point on, every book somehow just gets better and better, with crazier floors, better adventures, and some unforgettable and hilarious characters. The characters in today's sculpt are great examples of that, as two of the most popular characters in the whole series, and we don't even meet them until books 3 and 4. Let's start with Prepotente, who's also known as Pony. He was just a normal goat prior to entering the dungeon, but after arriving he ate a magically enhanced pet biscuit, kinda like the one that Donut ate, transforming him into a super intelligent bipedal caprid with absolutely no people skills. We meet him late in book 3 in the middle of the Iron Tangle, where he immediately lets out a screaming goat scream directly into Carl's face. Then from that point forward, the author Matt Dinneman somehow took the character, who by all means should have been nothing more than a one-off screaming goat joke, and turned him into a pivotal, lovable character with one of the most emotional arcs in the entire series. Despite his lack of social skills and his tendency to scream anytime someone threatens or challenges him, he's still one of the most powerful crawlers in the dungeon, with his only weaknesses being his love for his mother and soda pop. And that's Prepotente, and if you think he's weird, then buddy, go ahead and strap in before we discuss the other character in this sculpt. Samantha, whose real name is Samantha, is well, there's really not a good G-rated way to describe her. Honestly, I don't think there's a good PG-13 description either. I'll give it a shot. Samantha's a minor deity with a wild and crazy backstory who was banished to the nothing by her father, and eventually her spirit was trapped inside of a half-human, half-naiad latex doll head. More specifically, a love doll head, with gaudy makeup, pigtails, little plastic fangs, and big red lips you'd typically associate with that kind of doll. But as nothing more than a severed doll head, she rolls around the dungeon with Carl and Donut, picking up leaves and dirt and blood and grime as she goes, constantly causing chaos as one of the most unhinged characters in the series. She is crude and impulsive and basically indestructible, and has absolutely no filter whatsoever, and she's constantly saying the most off-the-wall things, making everyone around her deeply uncomfortable with her vulgarity. And I love her. Aside from Quasar, she might actually be my favorite character in the entire series. But as I said, aside from a few interactions here and there, these two really don't have much to do with one another, so they make an odd pair for a single sculpture. But I wanted to make them both, and I couldn't decide which one I wanted to sculpt more, so into the same piece they go for a little more reason than I love them both, and I thought they'd be fun to make. Which means my super sophisticated and highly trained artistic concept for this piece is because I wanted to. I'm using the cover for The Butcher's Masquerade as reference for these two, and also as an excuse for my vision for this sculpt, which I'm imagining is the two of them standing, or hovering in Samantha's case, in the midst of a dungeon battle. So I'm placing Pony in a pose similar to the one on the cover, with a foot propped up on a muddy mound, Captain Morgan style, with a big red in hand, which he always drinks before beeyattle. Also, I figured out how to properly make a hood, which took me for a ride on the struggle bus in my last video with Skeletor. Anyway, I spent the bulk of the process of building Pony's body babbling about my love for the series, so now we're ready to get started on his head, which should be a journey because I've never sculpted a goat head before, so we'll see how this one turns out. I got started by shaping a ball and a glob of clay into a base for the goat head, and then set some little steel balls in place for the eyes, which immediately makes it read more like Littlefoot than Prepotente. I then cut an opening for the mouth and hollowed it out to make room for teeth and a tongue later on, because I want my Prepotente to look like he's screaming. Then I added some eyelids to the eyes, which turns our Littlefoot into more of a Charizard, so we're just kind of cycling through dinosaur-themed characters for now. I looked up some goat references to try to break away from the dinosaur look, and realized that their heads are actually a lot more rounded on top, so I added some clay to build up that volume and correct the shape, only to end up with something that looks more like a Stegosaurus or some other dinosaur I probably wouldn't be able to pronounce anyway. So for now, we're still firmly trapped in the dinosaur phase of this sculpt. But I think I figured it out. I added a little nose and blended it in, which definitely helped dig us out of that dino vibe, but now we're leaning more cow than goat, so we're really putting Prepotente through it, trying to find his form. Next, I used a sharp tool and a wire brush to score in a bunch of small lines to try to imitate fur. Later on in the paint stage, my plan is to give the whole head a wash so that the paint flows into all of the recessed areas of these scratches, and then do a few dry brush layers on top, which should make the texture of the fur pop really well. After that, I give him some teeth and then shoved a tongue into his mouth to try to make him look like the screaming goats in my reference photos, but he just looks more like the "What's up guys" from that Budweiser commercial, but you know, it's whatever. I then made him some horns and secured him to his head with a few pieces of armature wire and a dab of bacon bond, and then cut out some strips of clay to make his ears. I shaped the ears around a big ball stylus to round off the square edges and then blended them onto the head before scoring in some fur. Then I added a few more thin strips of this glittery Sculpey 3 around the head to use as a base to score in the rest of his fur. I bought this glittery Sculpey by accident on a previous project, but I came to find that I really like the texture. I don't know what it is, but it's not the same as the other Sculpey 3 colors I've tried. It's soft like the original Sculpey, but it doesn't crumble as much, so I really like to use it for textured items like hair and fur and clothing. Once the head is done, that means the sculpting phase for Prepotente is done. Even though he looks a little cuter than intended, I still like him. But that means we're ready to move on to my favorite little ball of chaos. That's exactly how I got Samantha started, with a ball of clay wrapped around a ball of aluminum. Samantha's supposed to be a doll, which means that her skin needs to be pretty smooth, so I opted to use Super Sculpey as it already kinda has a plasticky finish. Plus it holds an edge better and doesn't pick up fingerprints as easily as the softer clays that I use. Once I got the basic shape of her face roughed out, I then hollowed out her mouth, which felt a little dirty given the character, and then I used a little cookie cutter thingy I found on Temu to cut out her eye sockets. Then I shoved in some pre-baked eyes and got started on her nose, which I tried to make nice and dainty without making it look like Michael Jackson. After that, I added some thin strips to make her eyelids, doing my best to make them look uniform and symmetrical, so naturally they're very asymmetrical and kinda all over the place. But you know what? So is Samantha, so it fits. Her right eye is giving off just the slightest hint of a stink eye at the moment. But I may be able to pull off a forced perspective trick with paint, kinda like how Disney does with the castle. By slightly adjusting the size of the irises, I may be able to distract from the stink eye and make the eyes read as more symmetrical. But in the meantime, I put her little plastic fangs in her mouth and then added her lips, trying to make them look huge and ridiculous, like they have way too much filler. After that, I gave her some pointy little ears because I guess a naiad's like a fairy or something, and fairies have pointy ears. Then I gave her some excessive lash extensions, so she's really starting to look like she's straight out of Brentwood, Tennessee, and then I added her little half neck thing, which she refers to as her... You know what? Let's just leave that one alone for now. After that, I took the same glittery Sculpey 3 I used for Pony's fur and rolled it flat and attached it to her head in the shape of her hairline. I cut a circle out of the hair and then drilled a hole into the head, which I've baked in stages along the way to create a slot that I can put the armature wire in, which will support her pigtails. I'll also use the pigtails to support the rest of the head, as the goal is to kind of make it look like she's floating. Once the armature wire was shaped and in place, I wrapped it with more clay and then scored some lines into it to suggest strands and match the rest of the hair. Finally, I added some loose hairs to add some more volume so it didn't look so flat, and with that, the sculpting phase is done and we are ready to paint, which I started with a simple flat gray base coat. The sculpt was baked prior to the base coat, so I'm able to remove Samantha for now to make it easier to reach Prepotente. I start by adding the darker wash that I mentioned earlier. I used a homemade thinner, which is just a mix of distilled water and matte medium and a slow dry medium so that the wash would flow better and get into all the recesses and grooves of the fur. Then I take this flat brush to apply a few dry brush coats of lighter browns to give the fur some variation and make the texture pop. I prefer to use flat brushes like this rather than the round brushes that are intended for dry brushing. I'm sure it's a user error on my part, but I just seem to get better results and have more control when I use the flat brush instead of the round brush. I also use the round brushes for blending, so the brushes themselves are probably not in the best shape for their intended use. But there really is no right or wrong way to make art. Whatever works for you, as long as you're having fun, am I right? In the cover that I'm using for reference, Pony has normal round human-like pupils, but I decided I wanted to give him some classic square goat eyes. Then I finished off the horns with a few strokes of a handful of different browns and got started on the body. You may notice that I prefer to work from the bottom layer to the top layer when I can. In this case, the fur is the bottom layer, followed by the robes, then the belt. It just allows me to paint a little looser without worrying about staying in the lines. So I know if I get paint on the robes while painting the fur, then I'll cover it when I get to the robes. Then if I get purple on the belt, I'll just cover it when I get to the belt. Granted, the higher the layers go, the more I have to paint within the lines to avoid messing up the completed layer below, but typically the lower layers cover more surface area, so the higher layers take less effort to keep clean. In this case, the robes are much bigger than the belt, so I can paint faster and looser over a larger area of the sculpt without worrying about the smaller area of the belt. It's not really necessary, but it's just how I like to do it most of the time, with the exception of the bottle. Technically, the bottle in his hand is the lower layer, but the hand is far more detailed while the bottle is just mostly flat colors. so it was easier for me to do the hand first and then use the flat colors of the bottle to cover any browns from the hand. But the bottle was all that remained for Pony, so with that done, we're ready to move on to this little turd, and following the practice from lower layer first, I decided to start with her eyes. The idea here is to detail the eyes first, and then once they're dry, cover them with a layer of liquid mask. That way I can apply the next few layers fast and loose without having to tiptoe around the eyes. Because the eyes are in a small and slightly detailed location, if I were to paint everything else first, then I would have to tiptoe around the eyelids and the lashes to detail the eyes. Is that the end of the world? No, not at all. But look how clean and easy the process was when I peeled the mask back off the eyes. Anyway, after that I added a nice bright obnoxious red to her lips before moving on to her hair. The book describes her hair as bone white, but I thought that plain white or gray may wash her out, so instead I started with a basic blonde and then added a few layers of a less saturated yellow on top. I then detailed in some lighter strands to break up the color and finally finished Samantha by painting her hair ties the same pink as her eye makeup before moving on to the base, which I just painted as a muddy mound of earth. I dabbed the same muddy color onto Prepotente's hoofs to tie the figure into the base and then did the same on the ends of Samantha's pigtails. And with that, the sculpt is all done and we are ready for the final reveal. Right? Nope. I dropped the sculpt on the floor while cleaning my workspace and about my pants in the process, but luckily the only thing that broke was Pony's horn. So to fix it, I filled in the gap with some UV resin and then used a blade to scratch in some hairs. I then applied the brown wash to the base and then covered it with a white to match the surrounding hairs, and just like that, Pony is fixed and all good as long as you don't look too close. And now on take 2, Pony and Samantha are finally ready for their reveal. As always, I hope you enjoyed this fun little project of 2 characters that are very near and dear to my heart. If you haven't read Dungeon Crawler Carl, go do it. Don't read any descriptions or reviews, just strap in and go for a ride. But if you enjoyed the video, do me a favor and give it a like and then subscribe to the channel to see what we make next. The remake of one of my favorite games of all time comes out in a few weeks, so we may just have to hoist the colors and then sing some shanties for Edward Kenway. But that is all for now, so thanks for watching and I will see you on the next one.